Okay. Right, so we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning of Unit 1, and we're going to look at the theme of government in 1783 with a focus on Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister. So obviously, in terms of the context of the whole course, at the beginning of Year 12, we looked at developments from 1783 to 1812. So political developments, economic developments, social developments, etc. All right, so ultimately we're focusing on political developments up to, well, it's at 1812, not quite up to 1812. We'll be looking really at Pitt's record, his domestic record as Prime Minister. So in terms of his record as Prime Minister during the war years, that's something we can come back and look at in a future booster lesson. So the focus very much today is on looking at Pitt as a domestic Prime Minister. So the focus is, first of all, we're going to have a quick recap, on why did Pitt win the 1784 general election, and more importantly, and this ties in with the essay question, how did he go about tackling Britain's problems? So if you recall, there were massive issues with the national debt. The whole system of taxation needed major reform. Pitt was clearly an early adherent of free trade, so he made many important reforms certainly in reducing tariffs, and obviously that necessitated a very ambitious program of taxation. But he also went about looking or trying to reform government. I guess if he was around today, we would say he was doing something similar to what's happening in America at the moment with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. You know, tackling sort of government waste, tackling government, red tape and corruption. And we'll have a look at some interpretations around that as well. So, all important context. When our course begins in 1783, obviously Britain is just coming out of the wars with America, the humiliating defeat, the loss of the colonies, which of course led to a loss of confidence in government as well, particularly in the figure of George III, who, as well you know, did suffer from periodic sort of episodes of mental health. But there was also a crisis in the public finances. The national debt had gone up to a staggering £240 million by this time. And again, I'll leave it up to you to go online and see what that amounts to in today's money. As previously mentioned, the government was riddled with corruption and inefficiency. So Pitt came into office aged only 24, which even by today's standards is extraordinarily young. And I guess particularly in the first administration, the mince pie administration, if you remember, so-called because he wouldn't last much longer than after Christmas, he was certainly seen as a bit of a schoolboy in office, as the king's puppet. So, how did Pitt, therefore, why did he win the general election early in the next year? If you remember, the crucial factor here, of course, was that he was the king's choice, much more so than Fox. The king hated Fox. He hated the prospect of a Whig coalition. Remember, the Whigs at this time, of course, were far more advocated for far more restraints on the monarchy. So the Fox North coalition, which had held power, the king had no intention of allowing that coalition any, I guess, reasonable time in government. So the king was a big supporter of Pitt. If you recall, he influenced the election. He used royal influence to secure seats, to buy support. So in that respect, Pitt had, he had vital finances and support behind him in a way that the Fox Whigs did not. If you remember, there was also the pretext for the king dissolving parliament and getting rid of the Fox North coalition was because of their handling of the East India Bill. Remember, this is very early stage of Britain as it was developing its colonies in India. This was seen as something of a power grab by Fox, and that was certainly the excuse that the king used to dissolve that parliament. But what Pitt had, of course, was he was a real intellect. He politically he was very skillful, and he was able to win over many moderate MPs. And of course, what happens as a result of that? Prior to Pitt running in this election, of course, Parliament was dominated by Fox supporting Whigs. And so therefore it was impossible for Pitt to command any kind of support or majority in the Commons. As a result of this election, the composition of Parliament changes, and the Fox Whigs are effectively obliterated in Parliament. And thereafter, Pitt is able to gain the support he needs in Parliament in order to crack on with the business of government. So I think the key takeout here really is that the Pitt had the king in his corner during that whole election campaign. Okay, whether that was influencing the borough constituencies, whether that was using royal influence to secure seats, or using the royal funds. It was an election that was heavily influenced by George III. So, Pitt comes into office with this perception that he's a bit of a stooge, he's a gopher for the king. Obviously, the first parliament, he has no majority support in parliament, so it was very difficult for him to be able to sort of, pick up the machinery of government, as it were. And as such, of course, that first administration was called the mince pie administration because there was a perception it would not last much longer after Christmas. So the election changes all of that, and we have a new parliament, which now and Pitt is able to command a majority. Once that's in place, Pitt sets about solving Britain's problems. So, as we've already mentioned, there was massive waste and corruption in government, and so that had to be tackled. Pitt was also, as I said, a very early advocate for what we would recognise as a system of free trade. And so a lot of the old tariffs and customs duties were out of date. They needed to be simplified or reduced altogether. Okay, and by doing so, that would create freer trade, and that would create better economic conditions, which would also, by proxy, create better or a more stable and peaceful society. Linked into that, of course, was reducing the national debt. Britain was, to the tune, as discussed, £240 million in debt. They had to make a significant chunk out of that debt in order to restore Britain's reputation as a nation in which creditors could have confidence. So they had to restore public confidence in the public finances. Now, if Pitt was about the business, of course, of rolling back customs and tariffs, then that was going to seriously dent government income. So they had to find that income in other revenue sources, hence why it went on this very, very sort of bold and very innovative policy of rolling out new taxes. So what were the problems with regards to, in terms of the machinery of government, within the administration of government? Rampant corruption, sinecures. So if you remember, and you can find this in the main textbook, all of these terms are defined for you. Where are we? So page, I think it's page 13, isn't it? No, I lie. It is over the page. It is on page 17. Yeah, so if you have the textbook open, that will help you. But if you remember, what was a sinecure? What was a sinecure office? It was effectively a position with a very competitive salary that was often handed out to MPs to gain the support, but required little to no work. Okay, what we would call by today's standards a cushy job. So it's almost like you hand out a very kind of broad portfolio to someone. Doesn't really even, I guess, put them on the front benches, as it were. It's not even really a ministerial position, but it's a way of buying support. And that's just one example of the scale of corruption and waste that was going on at the time. Okay, so the administration of government needed to be significantly reformed. There had to be proper public accounting. There had to be greater scrutiny and greater transparency inside government. So, the Consolidation Act of 1787, it set up a consolidated fund, and into this, all revenue received from taxes was paid out, and out of which government payments were made. Okay, so again, creating sort of greater transparency and accountability in government spending. An audit office was also set up, run by independent experts, with the specific task of overseeing public expenditure, and again, by doing so, at least in theory, curbing corruption. Okay, so the whole idea was that the administration of government should become more open, more transparent, and by doing so, that would root out corruption and it would root out government waste. Right? There was too many people earning, too many backhanders, effectively, for doing very little. Right? So, a little bit of historiography there on the slide. Asa Briggs, who we've referenced many, many times, he praised Pitt's efforts, saying, quote, they cleaned up government and by doing so, laid the foundations for what became later on in the 19th century sort of the benchmark for how governments, the professional manner in which governments were run thereafter. Okay, now trade reform. As I've already mentioned, clearly in the wake of the American Revolutionary Wars, there was a post-war slump in trade. Obviously, with the loss of the colonies, there was the loss of those markets in America. And perhaps more importantly, there was this rather out-of-date and complex system of tariffs which stifled trade and stifled commerce. So what we start to see, Pitt was a big supporter of Adam Smith. And he's very much, in that respect, he's very much ahead of his time. I mean, the whole debate around tariffs and free trade was something perhaps we associate more with Peel. As we'll see in a future lesson, in the 1840s, it was, Peel, of course, got rid of the Corn Laws. Probably one of the most famous examples of of a tariff that was, well, in that case, forcing up food prices. The whole debate around free trade and returning to some form of protectionism is ignited again very much towards the end of the 19th century, when people like Joseph Chamberlain were really arguing for a return to protective tariffs. So in this respect, Pitt was kind of, ahead of his time, really. This has become this system of tariffs and protecting your economy from sort of goods flooding in from abroad. That was so entrenched in the thinking of the time. So what Pitt was saying was very much against the grain of the consensus at the time. So he was very much sort of ahead of his time in that respect, in that he was a big believer in the virtues of free trade. Okay. So we have the Eden Treaty, brokered with France, which lowered tariffs and encouraged freer trade. He went about removing all of these archaic and obsolete duties, and again supported the Navigation Acts. And what we see from this is, of course, is a boost in trade. Okay, and setting up the system of free trade that would become sort of embedded in our sort of government institutions much later on in the century. So again, if you look at Pitt gets a lot of credit for that, for being sort of ahead of his time with regards to sort of advocating for a system of freer trade and getting rid of all of these outdated tariffs which were effectively stifling our ability to trade freely with other countries. And the idea is, once you remove those, trade becomes freer, we become more prosperous, and we have the trickle-down effect, don't we? Okay, and that in itself will eventually create better social stability because the economy is in a stronger position. Now, tackling the national debt, obviously, as we've established, the national debt exceeded £240 million after the War of America, and the annual interest payments were crippling the public finances. So, in your main textbook, you'll need to go back to page 15 now, okay, if you can follow along in there. You will recall, hopefully, that the big idea, the first step to restoring Britain's or to restoring confidence in Britain or to restore financial confidence in Britain, was to set up a sinking fund. Okay, and that was created in 1786, and £1 million a year was to be set aside, effectively ring-fenced within this sinking fund, which would then be used to pay off the national debt. Okay, so this sinking fund, of course, was tightly managed, as previously noted. £1 million a year was paid in from taxation. So again, this links into many of the sort of ambitious and very innovative new taxes that Pitt rolled out. And over time, it was successful. It did cut the debt, the deficit, by around about £10 million. It was successful in peacetime, but of course it was not successful in a time of war. So when the wars with revolutionary France beginning in the 1790s, this was something that couldn't really cope with the stresses and the expenditure of war. But certainly as a peacetime policy, the consensus amongst historians that it was very successful. And crucially, it boosted confidence in public credit. It restored Britain's reputation, put Britain on a much sounder financial footing, and obviously, in terms of as bankers and people interested in putting money into Britain, inspired more confidence in them to do so. Okay, and that's really, really important. As I've already mentioned, it was later undermined by the cost, the sheer cost of the wars with revolutionary France. So, taxes, sinking fund. Where does the money come from to put into the sinking fund? It had to come from taxation. With the reform of customs duties, which is going to, put a large dent in the government's revenue stream, where are they going to then raise the money from if they're not raising it on customs duties and tariffs? So it had to come from taxation. Okay. And if you remember, Pitt introduced, again, in your main textbook, page 16, if you want to follow along, Pitt was very innovative in the system of taxes that he eventually rolled out. So, first of all, the Commutation Act of 1784 reduced tea duty from 119% to 12.5%, which of course was to cut smuggling drastically. Okay, so if you go back to his obviously the tariffs, one of the reasons that smuggling was so rife, it was because obviously the goods were more expensive. Once you get rid of that, obviously goods can come back down to the normal price, and it makes smuggling less appealing. Because the smuggling was, goods coming into being smuggled into Britain, particularly on Britain's, all along the south coast. I mean, the whole southwest coast path that we use today for walking, that was, effectively set up by the Inland Revenue. They placed their agents across, spread out that whole 600 miles as lookouts to stop, goods being smuggled goods, reaching Britain's shores and then being brought further inland. So there was a real crackdown on smuggling. But ultimately, this had to be paid for because this is going to cut government revenue streams. So this is why this whole new system of taxation was rolled out. Okay, what did Pitt go for? He mostly targeted the wealthy, and he targeted luxury goods. That's where he saw where he would be able to raise the money from. Okay, so in your main textbook, it does give some really good examples here. Where are we? Yeah, he put taxes. These are what we call indirect taxes. You're not going to. Don't forget, at this point in time, there's no income tax. All right. Income tax is levied by Pitt for the first time during the Revolutionary Wars of France. And again, that was only levied on what we would today perceive as the ultra wealthy. So there's no income tax. So all the taxes have to be collected in an indirect way. Okay? So he put taxes on horses, on coaches, bricks, hats, playing cards, maids, servants, manservants, ribbons and candles. These are all commodities that were enjoyed, of course, by the wealthy and the aspiring middle classes, if you will. The window tax, and I'm sure you've probably, I know we discussed this last year, but if you're ever out and about, walking down perhaps, parts of Hitchin or St Albans and these older towns, oftentimes you'll walk past, say, a Georgian-looking building, and you'll see a window bricked up. Well, that's where it came from. Okay, the window tax. People, in order to get out of paying the tax, they chose to, well, we don't really need that window, so we'll brick it up. All right. So as you can see, those taxes, and again, Pitt was very careful not to antagonise, the poorer sections of society. So the tax burden fell most heavily on those who could afford to pay it. All right. So as I say, with the tariff reforms, they're cutting out a lot of government income. So they've got to recoup that money somewhere. Okay. Right, so that's the content. With regards to, obviously, the essay that we looked at last year, so we looked at this question very, very early on in the course, and obviously we were taking our first at the time, our first tentative steps into the brave world of A-level essay writing. And I think, if my memory serves me correct, I think it may have just been a verbalization exercise where we verbalized a judgment to the question. So Pitt's main achievement in the years 1783 to 1806 was to reform the administration of government. Now, last year when we looked at this question, we just talked about it purely in terms of domestic policies. Look at the dates in the question. Obviously, a full answer to this essay would also encompass his record as a wartime prime minister during the Revolutionary Wars in France as well. But for the day, again, we'll just focus on his domestic policies. So what they've given you, of course, in the essay question is the administration of government. They've given you as sort of the preferred factor. That's the conceit in the question. How valid is that view? Was that his greatest achievement, or do we need to look at his trade reforms? Do we need to look at his how he tackled the national deficit? Do we need to look at how he rolled out this progressive this progressive form of taxation, or rather innovative form of taxation? So I've modelled an introduction for you to this essay. As we now know, introductions at A-level are absolutely essential. It is where, the unpacking of the question takes place in a definite, in terms of what do we mean by the administration of government. Let's unpack that. What's the question? The question's asking us to consider that, but clearly we would need to consider other factors as well. Okay, the discussion. Okay, what else are we going to look at? Specifically, what reforms are we going to consider in order, to balance this essay? And then crucially, what's the direction of travel for your answer? What is going to be the outcome of your answer? That is where you embedded judgment and set out clearly a line of argument. And once that's done, the function, of course, of the main body of the essay is to develop the argument that you set out in the introduction. So each paragraph does a job. Okay? So in this introduction that I've mocked up, you can clearly see here in terms of where the judgment is taking place. I've said that whilst Pitt's administrative reforms were an important and lasting part of his legacy, they were not his main achievement. So again, good A-level essays will have that nuance. It's not, we're not going to be sort of falling into the trap of incredibly polarized thinking. We're not going to dismiss these out of hand. We're going to acknowledge they were important, and we're going to show that in the first main paragraph. But the judgment that's being embedded here in this example is, well, actually, the candidate feels there were more important. Pitt had his legacy wasn't just characterized by his administrative reforms, as it goes on to say. His most enduring contribution was in his financial and economic measures. So this candidate in this model introduction is clearly saying to the examiner, whilst I acknowledge how important the administrative reforms were, I'm going to argue that his financial and economic reforms were actually more important. And that's a line of argument that's being set out. It doesn't dismiss the importance of his administrative reforms, but the candidate is clearly going to argue that the other reforms were actually more important. So, I should have said, by the way, if you haven't already done so, there's a copy of this PowerPoint that I've posted on the Booster channel. Okay, so if you haven't taken a copy of it, take a copy of it in a second. So what I've done for you there is just to model how you would turn the stated factor from the essay question, the conceit in the question, how you would model that into now what we call a piece paragraph. So when we're planning essays, it's also really important to think about, right, how is this paragraph, how is it developing my overall argument that I set out in the introduction? That's tricky, isn't it? So each paragraph must be consistent with the preceding discussion. There must be a logical structure to your answer. What we don't want is to see a candidate set something out and say, oh, this is what I'm going to argue in my introduction. Then the main body kind of meanders around and doesn't really reflect that. And then they come to a conclusion which is not at all consistent or in alignment with the argument they set out. Now, that can happen, of course, particularly if you're not confident with the subject matter. That's the type of thing that can happen perhaps in year 12, very early on in a process when you haven't quite mastered the subject matter. I think once you become more confident with the subject matter, it's then far easier to say, right, okay, I know exactly what my judgment is on this issue, and here's the evidence I'm going to supply in order to argue my case. What we've discussed before in terms of the big difference between GCSE and A-level is obviously the point, the opening point of the paragraph, like, it's a quick summation. What's the main point that you're going to argue in this individual paragraph? Clearly, in an essay of this nature, where you have a factor that's been stated, that must be your starting point in the first main paragraph before you move on to look at anything else. So that should be clear in your opening big point. Like at GCSE, evidence is the meat and potatoes of historians, isn't it? You have to then flesh that point out. You have to provide credible evidence to support it. Now, at A-level, of course, that can be a little bit more advanced from what you would typically do at GCSE. If you're looking at, the economy, you might want to sort of, cite also, how many tons of coal are we producing? How many tons of steel? That type of thing. If you're talking about living standards, it might be sort of, looking at, the rise in wages and real wages. So you could, in other words, statistical data as well. Yes, acts of parliament, key dates, etc., but also perhaps some statistical data to support your argument. Now that's quite straightforward. That's just evidence. That's the meat and potato of history. Okay, you need to back up all your points of evidence. As we know, where it gets more complicated is when we start to analyze the evidence. And this, when we color code, this should form really the bulk of your paragraph. Now, what is happening in the analysis section? Well, you're unpacking the evidence. You're making sense of the evidence. You're explaining why the evidence is important to the argument and the case that you're making. Okay? So you're looking at its significance, the impact, that type of thing. So if you look at what we've got here, the big point is one of Pitt's most important domestic achievements was obviously the administration of government. You've got some evidence. He reduced the sale of offices and syndicate, introduced the Consolidation Act, created an audit office. That's all well and good. The difficult part now is, okay, why is this important to the issue in the question? Let's unpack it. These reforms were significant because this is where you're demonstrating the importance of the evidence to the issue in the question, to the argument that you've developed. Okay? So you're unpacking it. This is why it's important. This was the impact. As a result of this, this was the consequence. Over the longer term, Pitt was setting up something, he was improving the machinery of government, which would have a much longer term impact. All right, so all the second order concepts of history, cause, consequence, significance, you bring into play when we are making sense of the evidence. So the essays which are going to get to level 4 and above in the mark scheme must be fully analytical. So if you were to color code the first part of the paragraph, it's going to come out mostly, the analysis sentences are going to far outweigh the evidence. All right, you're not just describing what happened or what Pitt did, You'll now unpack it. This is why it's important. Okay. These are, this was the impact of this reform. These are the consequences. This was the immediate impact. These were the consequences over the longer term. The counter argument, again, our essays have to have balance. We have to have nuance in our essays, and we do have to acknowledge that there are other perspectives. And this is a good opportunity, in fact, where you can bring in the views of historians, and show that there are differing perspectives to this issue, that some historians may well cite the admin reforms as one, perhaps Pitt's most enduring legacy, even though whilst you acknowledge that, you clearly have already made a case where you think that the admin reforms perhaps are not his most enduring legacy. And then, of course, that's where you get into that little bit of evaluation towards the end of the paragraph, that mini judgment where you're linking it back to the argument that you set out at the beginning of the essay. All right? So overall, the way it's weighted, it's, again, if you're going to color code all of this, you'll hopefully, if you've done it correctly, you will see that the analysis sentences are the bulk of your paragraph. Counter arguments, a sentence or two. And then obviously in terms of the evaluation, you can see there, it's just that you've acknowledged the counter argument, but overall, whilst you're weighing up, the argument that you've developed in this paragraph with the counter arguments, on balance, as you've already set out in your introduction, you feel, well, in the case of this essay, you feel, well, you're acknowledging the importance of the administrative reforms, but obviously you are making the case that you feel other reforms, particularly the reforms in taxation, were more important. All right? So it's just, A-level as well, like GCSE, but much more so A-level in terms of, we talk about, essays which are fully analytical and in which the judgment is fully substantiated. So the judgment needs to be taking place throughout the entire essay. It is in the introduction, it's embedded, a line of argument is set out. There's always a judgment taking place at the end of each main paragraph. And then, as we know, the conclusion, using the skill of synthesis where we bring it all back together into a powerful summation of your main argument. That is a substantiated judgment because the judgment is taking place throughout the whole essay. And it's not a case of then just bolting on a few sentences at the end of the essay or in conclusion, I think that. All right, it's there, it's sustained, and therefore it's fully substantiated. So, you have a choice as part of, of your revision, your preparation for the mock exams. Because last year, I think this question, as I say, if my memory serves me correct, I think we only did the verbal exercise, didn't we? So I've given you a template for an introduction. What you can do is, what I would highly recommend is that you write your own introduction in where do you stand on this issue, what argument would you want to set out. I've done you the exemplar paragraph on the administrative reforms. So what you can do is choose either trade reforms or Pitt's new system of taxes and turn that into a fully developed piece paragraph. Okay? And as I've said, the bulk of that paragraph really should be the analysis, because it's within the analysis that you are really developing the argument that you set out in the introduction. Okay? Remember, the function of each paragraph is to do a job, and that is to develop the case that you set out. Okay? It's not easy, it's difficult. And I know perhaps the danger here is that I've over-mechanized this. I mean, sometimes it causes overlap. Sometimes, you're looking at what you're doing within the analysis, you can clearly see some evaluation going on there as well. Obviously sometimes there is overlap that will take place. But the important thing is, I think for me, the key is that paragraph really develops the case that you set out. It does take on board counterpoints, Obviously, we want to write a response that's nuanced, but within that little bit of evaluation at the end of that paragraph, it's absolutely clear why the case that you're setting out, why you prefer that over perhaps to the views of those historians who might say something different. Okay, right. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And so if there's any, we'll do some question and answers if you have any questions to ask. I'm just going to stop that.